Hello, I'm Lorie Karnath, and I'm the managing editor of Molecular Frontiers Journal, published under World Scientific. MFJ is an open access science publication with a global platform with the aim of providing cutting edge science to all those who wish access. So it's exactly cutting edge science that brings me here today to speak with David Edwards and Bob Langer, two very exciting scientists. David Edwards is the professor of practice of biomedical engineering at Harvard University. His scientific work concerns the research and development of drug delivery platforms for treating infectious diseases in the developing world. He's the founder of Advanced Inhalation Research, also of Pulmatrix, and of Medicine in Need, an international non-governmental organization aimed at developing new drugs and vaccines for diseases of poverty, such as tuberculosis. David is also the founder of Sensory Cloud. And we're going to be talking a lot more about Sensory Cloud in a little bit. They're the creators of FEND, the free calcium-enriched nasal salt, which is in effect a nasal filter, which could greatly reduce virus transmission, and we'll learn a bit more soon. Bob Langer is a chemical engineer, scientist, entrepreneur, inventor, and one of the 11 Institute professors, the highest honor given at MIT. He's also a faculty member of the Harvard-MIT program in Health Sciences and Technology and at the Koch Institute for Integrative Cancer Research. Bob is a widely recognized and cited researcher in biotechnology, especially in the fields of drug delivery systems and tissue engineering. His publications have been cited over 320,000 times, and according to Google Scholar, Bob is one of the 10 most cited individuals in history and the most cited engineer in history. So Molecular Frontiers Journal has just published a very exciting paper that Bob and David and others have authored describing a nasal hygiene product, which, as mentioned, has the potential to significantly reduce COVID-19 transmission risks. So I want to start a little bit with talking about that, if you don't mind. David, why don't we start with you as the founder and developer of this technique. Could you tell us a little bit about it? There are many questions, so give us a little background and we can go into some of the questions.
Thank you so much, Lorie. So FEND is a nasal saline, of which, as you know, there are many and have been many for many centuries, actually. The notion of inhaling or spraying or placing salt in the nasopharynx is really well established as a way of clearing mucus and with some other benefits. What we have found over the last months especially, but this work goes back 15 years with Bob and myself, is that when you breathe certain kinds of salts, and particularly calcium-enriched salts, through the nose and into the trachea and main bronchi, where we generate respiratory droplets when we breathe, or certainly we generate them also when we cough and talk. This salt calms the mucus. It actually lands on the top of mucus surfaces and it strengthens them, and it therefore lowers the generation of respiratory droplets. And the point of this, the benefit of this, is to diminish the airborne presence of respiratory droplets that can potentially carry infection. So when we get infected with SARS-CoV-2, and it's true with influenza and other pathogens too, typically those pathogens land in the nose and the upper airways. And if they remain there, the immune system cleans them out. So the mucus will trap these pathogens, and cilia will clear them to the nose, to the mouth where we swallow them. What's problematic is when they get back in the air and therefore can penetrate into the lungs and cause deep lung infection, or go back into the atmosphere and potentially infect others. And the last thing I just want to say is that most of these droplets are smaller than 1 micron, And masks, conventional masks, surgical masks, are not really designed to filter those particles out. And so we've heard a lot in the news over the last months about these respiratory droplets and the dangers that they can pose for COVID-19 transmission. So lowering those, a hygiene intervention that lowers these particles that can potentially transmit disease, is a benefit both to the user and to those around the user. So we think it's a really interesting new hygiene protocol that can be useful in the management of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Thank you. So you speak about the management of the hygiene protocol. So Bob, maybe you could speak to us a little bit about, you see this as an alternative to masks, or does it work in conjunction with masks, or what is the best way to utilize this product?
Well, I think that the more things you do, social distancing, masks, I think all these things are, to me, are synergistic. I recommend all these things, and that's personally what I do, social distancing, try, stay away from people, wear a mask. And then I have this device. This is David's device, which I could show you. And, but I take it a couple times a day, just do this. So I think you want to do all those things. To me, the more things you do, that the better. Again, David's more of an expert than I, but that's how I think of it.
Amplify on what Bob just said. As we show in the paper that we've just published with Molecular Frontiers, masks, if they're clean, surgical masks are really recommended, are really effective at stopping the larger particles. And larger particles have more mass, and so they can carry pathogen, and they're kind of a brick wall to larger particles. Fend, in a way, you can think of Fend making a normal mask into an N95, and that N95 masks are able to do a really good job at filtering even the very small sub-micron particles, and Fend does that. So if you cannot wear a mask, if you are eating or you're in an environment where for some reason you cannot wear a mask, Fend is a really good alternative. But as Bob says, the special recommendation here is to use Fend as an addition to existing protocols.
Mm-hmm. And what about for things like airplane flights and things like that? Will that
Yeah. So in fact, one of the real challenges we're all facing now is, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, as winter's coming along, is we're finding ourselves increasingly in indoor environments and possibly in stagnant air environments, or environments where we're going to be for a long period of time with others. A plane is an example of the latter. And while typically you're in, or often, or hopefully you're in pretty well circulated environments, it's true that these small particles we're talking about, they're the ones that go beyond 2 meters and they can linger. Just to make a point, here in America right now, we have, as you know, fires burning in California. We have particles over this sky here in Boston that are coming from California. And those particles are really small. They're the ones exactly the size that we're talking about. So these particles can transmit great distances and linger. So Fend in airplane travel, or in mass transit, or any kind of a enclosed environment situation is a really good means to lower risk.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That sounds very hopeful for many of us. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the results that you detail in the paper and what you found.
Absolutely. So we did a first human volunteer study earlier this summer that we published in August. It was 10 individuals. And so we were interested in expanding the number of human subjects. And frankly, we have multiple trials going on right now around the world. What we published in Molecular Frontiers are 3 studies. The largest study took place at a food processing company called No Evil Foods in North Carolina. So we performed a placebo-controlled a study evaluation of 76 employees. There were actually two children of employees. We evaluated exhaled aerosol amongst the 76 before and after administration of FEN, this calcium-enriched nasal saline. And then we compared it to a placebo of simply saline. It's a nasal saline product that you can find on the market. And what we found was that, well, firstly, interestingly, there's a really broad distribution in exhaled aerosol between individuals. So some exhale many more particles than others. So some are exhaling 5 particles per liter of air, and others are exhaling 10,000. And we found that age and high BMI are both contributors to high exhaled aerosol, while generally it's hard to predict exactly where one is in one's exhaled aerosol fingerprint or footprint or air print. It was clear, because we measured both on a first day and a second day, that individuals' exhaled aerosol varies in time. But what most interestingly we found was that in administering FEND, the exhaled aerosol diminished quite dramatically. On average, for the group of 76 people, the diminution was 75% of total number of particles. And that number was even higher for those who exhaled more. So the effect of FEND was essentially like the effect of soap in a certain way, in that it cleared airborne particles from the airways in proportion to the number of particles in the airways. So the dirtier the air, the more the effect. And then the placebo nasal saline control had no statistical effect. And really rapidly, we did 2 other studies. One was with children and their parents, looking at the effect of surgical masks in comparison with FEND. And there, as I was commenting earlier, we found that both masks and FEND are effective, and they're different. So while masks tend to particularly eliminate the larger particles, they have some effect on the smaller particles, but not as much as FEND. FEND tends to act on all particles. So depending upon how large the particles that one is exhaling, and I should point out that generally we're exhaling roughly 80 or 85% of the particles from our airways that are less than 1 micron. But because there's a lot of mass in the larger particles, what you really find is that the FEND is more effective at eliminating total particles, whereas masks in many cases are more effective at eliminating the larger mass. So there's a real complementarity between the two. And the last thing to say is that we had a family in quarantine here in Boston, and were able to assess their exhaled aerosol. There was a woman who 8 days post detection, post symptoms, was detected as positive, went into quarantine with her husband and 2 children, and we measured her exhaled aerosol and that of her husband and 2 children over the course of several days once she was detected. And what we found was that her exhaled aerosol was very high relative to her family members, and that FEND lowered that exhaled aerosol for several hours on the 2 days that she had elevated levels. Interestingly, when she was told by her doctor 10 days post symptoms that she was free to leave her quarantine, her exhaled aerosol fell automatically to a very low level. So this phenomenon, which we talk about more in another paper that will be coming out, of infected lungs producing high numbers of aerosol particles is really intriguing as we seek to understand transmission of COVID-19 and this phenomenon we've all heard about, super spreading.
Mm-hmm. So that brings me to a question that, Bob, you were showing us how the product actually works. How long is the effect once you've taken a dosage, how long typically does it last?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I mean, David has been studying that also. I don't know that we, obviously, like most things, there's a kinetic pattern. In other words, so it would depend how you look at it. I don't know that we have an exact number on that. David, do you know?
Yeah, well, as Bob says, we're still assessing. We know that it lasts at least 6 hours. And so we now have about 2 publications and a third that will be coming out showing that at 6 hours, which is the total duration that we've actually measured effect, the FEND is still suppressing statistically. What we have seen, Lorie, is because we've often dosed, and indeed in the paper we've published with Molecular Frontiers, on a second day, and the effect is gone. And so we are assuming right now, our recommendation for use is based on a 6-hour duration. And I should just point out, and I, like Bob, have my FEND Mr. here with me. So when you administer, you have a first deep nasal inspiration. You want to fill your lungs with air. It's about 5 or 6 seconds, and we recommend to do that twice. FEND being a cleanser, a cosmetic from an FDA perspective, you can take 3 doses or you can take 4 doses. You can't overdose on calcium chloride and sodium chloride. I should point out that the amount of calcium chloride in a single administration, two inspirations, puts about 400 times less calcium in the body than a 6-ounce glass of milk. And so it's a really small amount of calcium and sodium that you're placing in your airways. So one can do it 2, 3. We recommend 2, and all of our results are based on 2 administrations.
Okay. So who will have access to this? When is this coming out, and who will have access?
So I, like Bob, academic and really interested in translational medicine. And so we both spin companies out. And so we've spun out a company from Harvard called Sensory Cloud. And I've been leading that company for the last year as we bring it to market, and we will begin to sell. It looks like the week of October 5th. People can purchase online at hellofen.com. We will, in the first months, be especially focusing on essential workers, and we're also doing some pilots in schools. We are, I should point out, in partnership conversations in India, in South Africa, and in Southeast Asia. And so it's our interest here in the coming months to enable pharmaceutical and other partners in these 3 markets to produce, manufacture and sell in those countries. And so we are particularly right now in a clinical trial in Bangalore, and probably most advanced toward making the product available in India relative to other countries. So in the nearest term, the next few months, the product will be relatively limited availability, but we'll be scaling up pretty dramatically in the new year.
Okay. In terms of the research that you conducted and which led to these developments and the article, et cetera, were there any big surprises along the way?
Yeah, totally. So Bob and I could talk a lot about surprises and doing new things. And I'm happy to turn this over to you, Bob. I can comment. Do you have any comments you want to make here?
Well, I think we were just excited to see what the results were, and actually that we could see what would happen on human beings in terms of, decreasing the aerosols. I mean, there are all kinds of things, but, I think it's very exciting to see, it actually have such a significant effect so soon.
Yeah. So to then, yeah. So the answer is yes. And as Bob says, it was really gratifying to see the effect. So to begin with, Bob and I, years ago, started a first company together, which related to inhaled insulin. And because of that company, in the early 2000s with anthrax and the first SARS crisis, we began to explore this question: how do you protect people against an inhaled pathogen, the nature of which we don't know? And that led to a first surprise in that we did a human trial in the early 2000s where we were looking at whether lung surfactant could be helpful in reducing aerosols, as we're describing, and we found that the placebo actually was a better effect than the active, meaning that the saline that was delivered to the lungs seemed to have an effect. And that led to years of research. So that was a surprise. My background is in applied math, and particularly in surfaces and how they deform. And it became quickly clear that the salt was having this synergistic effect on the protein molecules in mucus, and making mucus work better. I should point out, Lorie, that when you measure exhaled aerosol of children, you often can't see a single particle. And so when you breathe in, the air that flows over your trachea and main bronchi is nearly in turbulent conditions. So it's really fast relative to the surface of the mucus in those anatomical regions. And if your mucus is not really strong, it can break up the mucus like wind breaks up the sea into mist. And the weaker it is, the more it breaks up. In children, it not surprisingly, their mucus is great. And so they tend to make very few particles. Now, some children can make more particles than others. And as I mentioned, infection is a good reason why. One of the children whose aerosol we measured had a history of chronic bronchitis. And in her case, she had quite a few more particles. In any case, we realized that salt had this effect, and then kind of the science led us to calcium because of its nature as a divalent salt or element, was particularly effective. So fast forward to COVID-19, and a first surprise was an email I received from Bob's daughter, actually, Susan, who wrote to us, basically, I guess to Bob and then to me, sort of wondering whether there wasn't something that we could put in the Airways to help people. And I, at that point, had become really interested in olfaction biology and had started this company, Sensory Cloud. And so, to make a long story short, we answered to Susan yes, and we went to the FDA with Bob, myself, and a colleague, Denny Osceola from Mass General Hospital. And again, to make a long story short, we came up with this idea of bringing into humans a new hygiene intervention. And we didn't know at the time whether just depositing this salt aerosol in the nose and the very upper airways would be effective. So we had quite a bit of data showing that pulmonary delivery helped, but there were issues of really drug issues once you deposit to the entire lungs, and we were interested in just focusing on the hygienic aspect that we're highlighting in the paper we're publishing with Molecular Frontiers. So the first study, which was, again, just 10 people and that we published earlier this summer, showed quite a significant effect, which was, I think we were surprised by. In the most recent work, I can say that I was not anticipating that there would be such a uniform effect. So it was true that in all but 2 individuals, you saw this really dramatic reduction in exhaled aerosol. And I'm not talking, there's some people who breathe out so few particles that it's really, there's just noise there. It's not much effect that you can see. But in those who exhale significant numbers, everybody found we saw this really significant reduction. And the two people who we didn't see a reduction in, one had a deviated septum, meaning that she couldn't breathe properly through her nose, and the other had a obstructive sleep apnea, so similar issue. So the soap-like effect of Fen, I think, has been surprising. Another surprise, you never know when you bring a new behavior to people, whether they'll adopt it, actually. And so it's hard to change consumer behavior. And Bob and I are more familiar with the healthcare FDA drug and vaccine approved process, where you have a doctor who's sort of assigning a behavior. But once you move into a consumer health situation where we are now, it's really, what do people want to do? And so you never really know. And so I could talk quite a bit about this, but just, it's been, we're learning a lot about consumers, and clearly the nature of the pandemic, the fact that the media, the WHO, the CDC, scientists around the world are talking a lot about exhaled aerosol, respiratory droplets, and small particle transport of disease, has made the concept of FEND more intuitive, and that was a surprise.
Yeah, so your last comments bring me to the next question. Especially in the United States, we've had a difficult time getting people to wear masks oftentimes. So what are your thoughts on people adopting this product? I mean, it may be that it's easier to use. A lot of people are disturbed by the mask. It's uncomfortable. What do you think the acceptance will be?
Well, I'll say some things, and then Bob, I'll let you also comment on this. But I think that Lorie, where we're most focusing now, and where adoption we're encouraged by what we see, is in protocols in factories and offices and establishments where people are gathering. Most of these, as you know, have adopted and are adopting hygienic protocols. So one enters, one washes one's hands, one, of course, puts on a mask, and there's often the temperature measured and so forth. And introducing FEND in that context, where there's a gloved personnel who's administering the nasal saline, is a small leap. And because people we typically start these partnerships with an assessment where people can actually measure their own exhale aerosol and see the effect. And when you see the quantitative effect, it is compelling. And so it's kind of an easier adoption in a company or a hygiene bubble context. As people purchase the product and bring it home without any framing, that is a good question, is what will the adoption be? And I think we will see. We have had a lot of interest from consumers, but I think that we're going to learn. Bob?
Yeah, well, I'd just make a couple comments. One is, I certainly hope, as I was saying earlier, that people not only use FEND, but do use masks. I think you want to do everything you can to make sure that transmission is from one person to another is as minimal as possible. So I think this is a good thing to do, but certainly you want to do masks as well. I think David said it very, very, very well before, that both have advantages. So the more you do, the better. I'd also add that in the case of FEND, I think one thing that's very important is that now all the work that David has led has been published. It's been published in very good scientific journals like Molecular Frontiers, and I think that's very important. I mean, it's not just it's not just saying that it's good. It's really now been multiple publications showing that it can do some real good, and I hope that the fact that it is been peer reviewed and in scientific journals that are very good will make a difference to people. But still, that message has to get out there, and ultimately, it's media and other places that do that. And it's a question, I think, of how the media behaves.
Mm-hmm. Now, so you spoke a little bit about this earlier, David, and maybe Bob, you have some other comments about some of the other applications that FEND may serve. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the going back to the origins of FEND, it's a non-specific hygiene intervention. So again, similar to hand washing and similar to masks, it has a hygienic benefit that really is independent of the pathogen. So one obvious application of FEND is to the flu. So influenza is another airborne pathogen with similar anatomical features in terms of where it deposits and where it infects. And so FEND, and I want to say a couple comments before I go further here, Lorie, in terms of what FEND does and how to think about it. So it's helpful to think about the nose and the upper airways as a kind of physiological mask. And so we breathe in, as we say in the paper, we breathe in every day, typically between 100 million and 10 billion particles. And most of those deposit in our nose and upper airways. And so our nose and upper airways are designed to clear that. And so we have thick mucus and we have cilia that move the mucus to the mouth where we swallow it. The mucus, if we eat wrong, or if we have infection, or as we age, and probably other effects, can weaken and therefore can release particles or whatever's deposited in the upper airways into the air, and that can go deep and infect us or cause problems, because our deeper lungs, where gas exchange occurs, are not really designed to defend themselves against foreign particles. So if you get foreign particles deep, you tend to have a problem, or you can, or go back in the environment effectively. So FEND makes, in a way, your mucus younger and makes it stronger. So so influenza, another pneumonia and other airborne pathogens like measles and SARS and other coronaviruses, in the common cold has coronavirus. It's really interesting. I mentioned the problem of smoke and airborne particulate matter. We know that there's a special toxicity to insoluble particles that are smaller than 2.5 microns, and that's really well established at this point. When, as I mentioned, when you breathe in particles from the atmosphere, not only are the particles that are coming out of your lungs mostly smaller than 1 micron, it's the same thing, the particles in the air. So there's about 85%, typically 85% of the particles in the air are less than a micron in size. And so when you breathe these in, if they deposit in the upper airways, and so you have these insoluble particles, they should get cleared and you swallow them, but they may, if your mucus is not in good shape, get back in the air and go deep. So mucus is another hygiene that makes sense for polluted environments.
I mean, really, any infectious disease like the flu or other diseases that can be transmitted by aerosols, I see, this being useful for, not just COVID.
Mm-hmm. Now, you both have had a very long and productive career together to date, and maybe you could comment on how you first met and began collaborating. Maybe Bob, start with you. What made you see some promise in this David as a postdoc when he first came to your lab?
Yeah, so I remember that well. It must have been 1993. David, when he came to my lab, he was really had done almost all mathematical modeling. He'd actually written 2 books, 30 some papers, including modeling to the lung. And but he came very recommended to me by Bob Brown, who was now the president of Boston University. He was then He'd also been provost at MIT and chairman of chemical engineering, which was the department I was in. And I always had a lot of respect for Bob, and he didn't recommend people lightly. And when David came to see me, I just thought he was an incredibly bright guy. And, and I thought he would add a lot to the people in the lab, in terms of his ideas and what he'd done. I certainly didn't realize at the time how everything would lead, but it was very interesting. I mean, the first thing I asked him to look at was what's called transdermal delivery. Our lab does a lot of different things on drug delivery. And so I remember him coming back to me a few months later with this paper with 300 equations in it. And I always felt my big contribution was reducing it to 250 so that people would understand it better. But then I said to him that, I think this area of pulmonary delivery, lung delivery, is something that maybe he could make a really big contribution to, because it's so unbelievably inefficient. People, try to deliver different molecules with aerosolizers, and almost none of them can deliver more than 2 milligrams, or this was at that time. And what that would mean, and basically they lose about 98% of what they put in. So there's two huge problems with that. One is it makes it incredibly expensive when you lose so much drug. And two, it almost prohibits you from using almost all things that are aerosolized, because you'd have to, when you lose so much, 98%, you'd have to have a giant aerosolizer to deliver enough. And people want to put these things in their pocket and stuff like that. So I said to him, David, maybe we can work on a way to come up with a way to change this whole field of aerosolization. And so he read these papers and he came up with really a transformative idea that we published in Science. And I think is, in my opinion, the most important aerosol, from a pharmaceutical standpoint, breakthrough maybe ever, but certainly in the last 50 years. We published that in Science, and now it's been FDA approved and so forth. But I'll let David take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I from my perspective, as Bob said, I had been completely theoretical before coming to work with Bob. And in academia, the typical career is comprised of finding a mentor who is hopefully a pioneer in his or her field, and learning to go a little further than the pioneer. And so you kind of get to the frontier with the pioneer, and then you learn to move beyond. What happened with Bob was kind of a little quite different and empowering, in that Bob it's sort of said, well, kind of forget about me and even forget about you, but just look at challenges and problems that need to be solved that are big, and try to solve them. And so that really opened up my mind a lot. And Bob is a super encouraging and really brilliant, and surrounds himself by people like that. So I was transformed, I think, in coming to work with Bob. And while my career has gone on in lots of different ways since I met with Bob, I always, when I am at a frontier and feeling as if I'd like some company, there's nobody I think of before I think of Bob. So yeah, we have, particularly in this space of aerosol intervention, had a good run.
Okay, so that brings me to a quote that you made, which was over the last 2 decades that you and Bob have collaborated to do simple things to improve human health through the air. And you speak about the means of this inexpensive way to cleanse airways, may be the simplest idea of all. So what is it that is unique? You're both pioneers. So what is it unique that brings you beyond those frontiers to these new solutions? In this case, what you call a simplistic solution. What is it that leads you to this pioneering science?
Well, speaking for myself, I think that in a creative career, there's a few phases, and initially you're discovering yourself, and then you're kind of discovering yourself in the world. And at some point, you know, you're old enough to have children and to kind of realize kind of your time limits and so forth. And so impact matters. And I think that we've emerged here in a world where science and technology have a big role to play in, you know, sustaining the human condition, to be a little melodramatic. And it's, in my lifetime, never been more obvious than here in the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's really compelling to find solutions that are accessible, you know, and we're talking about 4 billion people being needing to go to work or needing to go to school and not really having the protections they need. This particular solution and the simplicity of it, what is for me really compelling is that it has a chance to get in the lives and help those people. We, you know, hopefully and almost certainly here after the pandemic, whatever that means, hygiene will be different, you know, and it kind of changed like that at the late 19th century, where there were a lot of reasons for that, and hand washing being a real emergent practice at that point. And so we're hopeful that, again, the simplicity and accessibility of FEND and FEM-like hygiene might become a global practice, and that would be really gratifying.
Bob, would you care to comment?
Yeah, first I agree with David about impact. I think the second thing for me personally, you know, has been role models. I was very lucky when I was a postdoc that the person I worked with was a man named Judah Folkman. He was a surgeon. And actually, when I worked with him, we were working on a project to discover what would be the first blood vessel inhibitors. And everybody criticized that work initially, as well as the drug delivery work that we were doing, or I was doing, as saying that they were impossible. And the great thing, and of course, both of those have turned out to now be very, very widely used. The first one would ultimately lead to drugs like Avastin and others that are widely used for treating cancer, and actually the only drugs that are used now to treat eye diseases from the back of the eye, like macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy. And of course, the controlled release work we did, you know, that's used by many hundreds of millions of people. But at the time, everybody would say that these were impossible. And, you know, but the thing was, Dr. Folkman, he was a great person, and he believed anything was possible. And I think that as something for me to watch, even though he was criticized a lot, the fact that he felt anything was possible was just a wonderful lesson. And so, you know, that's something I've remembered all my life in terms of what I try to do personally, but also what I try to do with people in the lab, like David. I want people to come away thinking that they can solve any problem, discover anything. I mean, not that we always do, but we try to do our best.
Well, I agree. In the opportunities that I've had to work with you on some different conferences and other programs, I've always felt that you very much convey that message to all, that anything is possible. So you certainly embodied Professor Folkman's message to you. So we all appreciate that, and we're grateful to both of you for your time today. And this is very exciting. I think that it'll prove to be very helpful for all around the world, and it gives us some encouragement and hope at a time when we really need it. And I think what you said, David, is true, that really science has come to the forefront during this crisis. I think people who thought they could get through the day using their computer or cell phone or whatever without understanding all the components and how it works, those days may be over, because we've suddenly realized how important science is. And I think that's part of our message today, and certainly part of Molecular Frontiers Journal and World Scientific's messages, that science is important to all. And we try to do everything we can to expand the messages of science and make it accessible to all. So again, I appreciate your time today, and thank you. And I also want to thank the World Scientific Team and Molecular Frontiers Journal team. And I look forward to speaking to you again very soon. And we're all looking forward to sharing your article. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorie.
Thank you, Lorie.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.